Hello students, welcome to ePathshala. My name is Prerna Trehan and I am an assistant professor at GGDSD College, Punjab University, Chandigarh. In today's modules, we will be looking at the thought of St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, both regarded as stalwarts of the medieval political thought in Western Europe. Throughout this module, we shall be firstly looking at the history of politics within the Christian thought. This Christian thought shall stand starkly in contrast with the previous ideas of Roman political thought as well as the ideas of Roman law and citizenship. Moving on, we shall be looking at the Conciliar Movement, which became the basis of the medieval political thought, especially keeping in mind the rise of Catholicism in Western Europe. Furthermore, we shall divulge into the ideas of St. Augustine and how he tried to incorporate the authority of the Church along with evolving the idea of a church state. Next, we shall be looking at certain features of the medieval political thought in the Christian world and how it had certain similarities as well as differences from both the Greek and its Roman antecedents. Lastly, we shall also be looking at Thomas Aquinas, who may be regarded as one of the leading thinkers of the medieval political thought in Christian world. His idea of man as a dual, spiritual as well as temporal being had a huge manifestation on his political thoughts as well. Elements which were added to political life at the beginning of Middle Ages were the doctrines of Christianity and political ideas of Teutonic barbarians. The ideas of the Teutons did not affect the political philosophy of the medieval period, but establishment of Christian religion and the development of Christian church became cardinal influences on the medieval political thought. Christianity, with its Stoic doctrine of equality of man in sight of God, and its emphasis on the supreme value of individual, appeared just after the Roman world. With the emergence of the dominance of Christianity, we see preeminence of political community being displaced by the religious community. Furthermore, the goal of the human beings was to live a life of virtue, but individual life was now linked with one's religious life instead of one's political life. In the works of St. Augustine, transition from the classical period of hostility between the church and a pagan state was to lead to a period of unity in a Christian church state as observed. St. Aquinas aimed to harmonize reason and revelation to reconcile the doctrines of the church and the rational pagan philosophy which the classical learning had made. Moving on, we now look at history of Christianity. Politics in the Christian thought. The founder of Christianity had little interest in political doctrines. In emphasizing the principle of golden rule, the morality of individual was appealed to, and the authority of the government was thereby minimized. Jesus carefully distinguished the spiritual kingdom and evaded every attempt to entangle him with the Roman authorities. Passive obedience to the powers were enjoined. Government was conceived as a means of carrying out God's will on earth. Only when the state interfered with the teachings of the church was disobedience permitted. Certain elements of political theory which the early Christian writers drew from the ideas and which increased as Christianity spread to the upper classes was more influenced by Stoic philosophy. The New Testament contains certain important statements concerning the doctrines of natural law, of human equality, and of nature of the government. The apostles adopted the cosmopolitan ideas of the later Greek philosophers concerning equality of men. The attitude of early Christians, such as like the Stoic philosophers, in the question of slavery was not altogether consistent. Civil government was viewed as a divine institution. It derived its authority from God. Obedience to the state was demanded as a religious obligation as well as a political necessity. The state existed to maintain justice. The state further had a sacred character. Its ruler was God's servant, and obedience was thus essential. The Christian theory of state was essentially based upon the later Stoic natural law. Furthermore, the government was considered necessary for proper human development. The Church Fathers adopted the idea of natural law. They recognized slavery as a legal and necessary institution. The Fathers also accepted the state as a divine institution. They taught that ultimate authority for government must be sought in God. Moving on, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, gradually it developed its semi-political organization. It further acquired property and power, built up its system of theology, as well as a new attitude as seen in its political ideas. The Church began to assume rights and dignities equal to that of the empire. The civil ruler was thus considered the vicar of the god. A line of separation began to be drawn between ecclesiastical and secular authority. The Church became more self-conscious and claimed independence, and there was a tendency to depreciate the importance of political authority and to exalt by comparison spiritual authority of the Church. Moving on, we now look at the Conciliar Movement. The Conciliar Movement was a 14th to 15th century reform movement within the Catholic Church. The main tenets of conciliarism was that the final authority in spiritual matters lay with the Church and was represented by a general council and not with the Pope. The Catholic Church had become, by the Middle Ages, the principal carrier of Roman imperial absolutism. And by attacking Pope's authority, conciliarism became inspiration for Western constitutionalism as well. Before Luther, the Catholic Church had to face a lot of criticism. Some critiques were fundamental, for instance, those questioning the idea of church as a mediator between the individual believer and God. Church is a collective body. The Catholic Church claims universal church open to all races, nationalities, and sects. Christ refuses no one from God's grace, and he sends his apostles to preach to all mankind. The conciliarists claimed that the ultimate religious authority lay with the Church. According to the conciliarists, the only way the Church could exercise this authority was through a general council consisting of its leading members. Initially, the conciliar movement advocated that power should be shared between the Pope and the Bishop in council. Later, it demanded unlimited sovereignty for the internally democratic Council of Bishops. The Church Council of Constance issued 2 decrees. The first, a general council is superior to the Pope in matter of doctrine. Second, the council must meet at regular intervals. Within the movement, the issue of how large a collective body was to act was further problematized. This collectivity was assumed to have a common interest, a smaller group that could act in its name. The political leaders of Europe who wanted their own authority enthusiastically supported the conciliarists, and they regularly interfered in the election of several popes in an attempt to keep power of the popes in check. The interference in church election was to displace the budding absolute monarchies of Europe. It gave up the idea that as the authority of Christian church was to be seen as devolving to the community of the Christian church as a whole and not just to the Pope. And similarly, the political authority was not to be led by the person of the monarch, but was to be in the hands of a larger elective body. Saint Augustine, his thoughts and preachings. The work of Saint Augustine embodies the transition from classical world to the world of Christendom, from the period of hostility between church and a pagan state to one period of unity of Christian church state. In his City of God, the most influential book written in the 5th century, he attacked paganism, traced Roman history to show the old gods have not saved Rome from misfortune, and argued that Christianity, if adopted by people, would save the state. This work was aggressively apologetic. He soon shifted his attention from the earthly to the spiritual city. By this he meant not only heaven, to which Christians looked forward to as their eternal home. His counterpart on earth composed of the body of true believers. The church was thus the city of God. Augustine imitated Plato in working out his ideal city and combining the philosophy of Plato with the doctrines of Cicero and the theology of Christian religion. He justified slavery as the result of the fall of man. According to him, slavery was both a remedy and a divine punishment for sin. He criticized Cicero's conception as an embodiment of justice. Justice for him was not created by civil authority, but by ecclesiastical, which existed as a principle of authority, independent of state. He broke away from the early church fathers and eliminated the elements of law and justice, which Romans considered as the basis of state. He considered state as a punitive, partly as remedial institution. Men were compelled to form social relations. Men originally obeyed rules of wisdom and justice. But as a consequence of sin, some men had to be subjected to the authority of others. He believed in divine origin of the state. He opposed the state as a diabolical institution. The fundamental distinction in Augustine's thought, however, was not between the church and the state, but between two societies. Augustine conceived the city of God as Christianized church state from which unbelievers are excluded, and claimed the supreme power of that state for the leaders of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Augustine's city of God dominated Christian thought for centuries. Thomas Aquinas, Dante, and Grotius drew largely from city of God for their writings. The work of Augustine gave to the Church a critical period of history and a crystallized body of thought, which put into definitive statement the ideal which gave it a distinct existence and self-conscious purpose. Thomas Aquinas, The Nature of Medieval Political Thought. From 5th to 9th century, the condition of Europe was such that it did not permit the philosophical or theorizing activity. The two social factors that influenced modern political thought in Europe were feudalism and Catholicism. Feudalism was the tenure of land from a feudal lord in return for military service. It was an institution ideally suited to the economic and military needs of the medieval times. Contract, not dominion, was the essence of feudalism. Catholicism, represented by the Roman Catholic Church with the Pope as its spiritual head, was dominant in the Middle Ages and influenced the political thought as well. It competed with the secular authority of the empire for a position of supremacy. Church competed with the secular authority for man's final allegiance. Its problem was its relation with the state. Its weapons were spiritual, and its strength was the belief of the people. Thus, in the Middle Ages, central theme was the relation between the church and the state. There were two universal empires, one spiritual, the other secular. Each claimed a universal dominion and the final allegiance of man. The medieval man was thus subject to dual authority of the Pope and the Emperor. His prime objective was to owe allegiance to the Christian Republic or the city of God, as St. Augustine had described it. Doctrine of the two swords characterized the medieval political thought. One sword symbolized the emperor, while the other was the symbol for the church. As church was the main dominating institution, decision of church in all matters was final. Church controlled the whole thought system, and there was no free play of different thoughts and ideas. Slavery was the consequence of sin, and persons involved in sinful activities were penalized by God. Medieval political thought thus made important contribution to politics. Some of these contributions are as follows. Firstly, politics was dominated by the insistence of man's duality, both as a spiritual being as well as a temporal being. Secondly, modern idea of representation developed during the medieval period, which saw the rise of the parliaments. Thirdly, St. Aquinas expanded the idea of natural law and made it an integral part of the Christian thought. Fourthly, there was a great stress on reason in natural law. Lastly, the medieval communes and guilds provided the basis of a new type of self-government. So Barker rightly observes, Middle Ages therefore are not dead. They live among us and are contemporary with us in many institutions of our lives and in many modes of our thoughts. Moving on, we now look at Aquinas' thoughts and ideas. The 13th century was marked by the culmination of papal power and by interest in speculative philosophy. The scholaristic writer of this period was St. Thomas Aquinas. He aimed to harmonize reason and revelation. He best represented the desire for his age for unification of knowledge based on divine revelation. He marked the beginning of the later medieval rational political thought, which combined with all theocratic and spiritual arguments. He described law as an ordinance of reason for the common good, promulgated by him who has the care of the community. He further introduced the idea of positive law, of rules actually formulated by a sovereign power in the state. However, and importantly, he viewed law as something universal, immutable, as well as natural. Positive law was only a corruption of law if it conflicted with the fundamental principles of justice. He further considered the various forms of law. He states 4 types of law. On the lowest level is the human law, composed of custom and other laws which are of human origin. Above that comes the divine law, consisting of revealed codes by which men are expected to live. Divine law is followed by natural law, which concerns God's reason in creating things. And finally, there is the eternal law, which stands above them all as ultimate reality of the universe. St. Thomas Aquinas based political authority on Aristotelian conception on the social nature of man. Aquinas believed that the city was too small and too weak for defense and preferred larger kingdom as proper type of state. He recognized the anarchic element in the doctrines of tyrannicide and rejected them. In spite of Aquinas' respect for reason, he felt that the greatest truths were still obtainable only through faith. He held that church should be given precedence over any secular power. It was the duty of the political ruler to administer secular affairs in a way so as to further God's will. If a ruler disobeys the church, he should be excommunicated. The authority of the priest was temporal as well as spiritual. The Pope was to be obeyed by all above rulers in matters of civil welfare and those relating to salvation as well. The theories of Aquinas were later made as the basis of the Jesuit system and exerted an influence through political activities. Let us now summarize whatever we have picked up throughout the module. Firstly, it is important to understand that the medieval period of political thought in the Christian world was entirely different from the pragmatic and realistic conception of politics that the Romans had. With the rise of Catholicism, the idea of spirituality now engulfed Western Europe, and political thought was mainly revolving around the idea of church as well as its spiritual authority. Firstly, the idea of medieval political thought based on the idea of God and the idea of natural law being of foremost importance. Furthermore, it was also regarded that the state was now looked at not as a legal institution but as a divine one. Therefore, the spiritual authority of the church as well as the Pope became extremely important. Though they tried to break the authority of the Pope by introducing collective bodies within the church, the spiritual authority of the same was not diminished. Moving forth, the idea of natural law as governing and more important than common law is also of great significance. Thomas Aquinas is important in this manner, as now man was to be divided into 2 ideas. Firstly, there was the spiritual idea, and next as the temporal being. Despite the idea of the temporal being, what was of foremost importance was the spiritual nature of man. Based on the idea of city of God as espoused in the ideas of Augustine, the idea that spiritual authority was to lead to the heaven became of foremost importance to the Western European political thought. Thus, moving forth and taking forth the ideas of slavery, now slavery was to be seen through the ideas of sin. Moreover, the state was now a divine institution, and law was to be based on natural law as well as reason. The idea that the law and eternal law of the God was foremost and of supreme importance was also crucial in this period. Thank you.